Hello, everybody. Nice to be here. So I'm JHarrington. I'm a partner at the Innovation Unit, and as David said, I do a lot of work around service design, which specifically looks at gathering insight around users, but also around kind of prototyping and testing ideas in order to develop new services and new systems of support. And I've been tasked today to talk to you about looking at exploring ideas through testing and engaging users through that process in order to develop and refine and build evidence for those ideas as you move forward for them. If we jump to the next slide. So I'm going to cover three key things across the presentation. First of all, I'm going to tell you some stories about three examples of practice, and I'm going to look at three different examples that each exemplify a different mode of testing. So we're going to look at examples that are about exploratory testing, about hypothesis testing, and about refining as a form of testing. And with each of those, I'm going to try and highlight some of the key factors of success that exist for each of those modes, so we can start to think about, depending on where we might be in our testing journey, what we might be wanting to achieve and some of the things that we need to pay attention to. And finally, I'm going to try and pull it all together by describing what this says about a model testing process, and we might explore that through understanding a prototyping-led process. So if we jump to the next slide. So the first mode of testing that I'd like to talk to you about is around this idea of exploratory testing. And this is around using real-world or sometimes simulated activities to explore some ideal practices and identify potential solutions. So we're not necessarily in the frame of knowing what the solution might be, but we can still use engagement with users and prototyping and testing to start to come up with those solutions, come up with those ideas. So next slide, I'm going to talk to you about an example in mental health, and specifically an example with Lambeth CCG. Now, Lambeth CCG are doing some really exciting work around their mental health. Specifically, they have a group called the Collaborative, which has been for some years developing some innovative solutions around mental health, which moves across both users and clinicians and GPs and communities. And they set themselves a specific challenge, which was looking at how they could move from the current crisis-led approach for those experiencing acute mental distress to move much more to a model of early intervention and prevention. So they didn't have a solution for what that might look like. And if we jump to the next slide, what they simply started with is they started by simulating both the existing and some of the ideal interactions that people would want to have in order to start to generate some clear principles for what good practice might be around crisis management. So they highlighted a number of different scenarios, core scenarios that were often very significant to people's decline into crisis and therefore into secondary care support, or ones that were very early on and could look at prevention. And through a number of large workshops working with clinicians, patients, carers, wider community members, GPs, they simulated with our support these interactions in these scenarios. And that included like swapping people's roles over. So people who with experience of mental health problems playing the role of clinicians within these specific scenarios in order to start to identify and elicit some of these principles for what good practice might feel like from that user perspective. And if we jump to the next slide, what we did then was we started to ensure that we were constructing a set of learning forums. And this is really significant, actually, because one of the things that you can do, especially within this exploratory prototyping and testing, is often people forget to convene and construct the right group of people to learn from these activities. And what Lambeth did was they took this collaborative principle that they work by and had a real wide-ranging group of individuals to learn from and explore what was being generated through this process, and specifically to learn against the principles that they defined, to understand what the solutions might look like against those principles. And if we jump to the next slide, What they then did was they took that vision and they tested it in the real world. And this was a brave step for them to do. They selected 12 individuals that they worked with over a period of 12 weeks, and they constructed a multidisciplinary team. They drew in people like community nurses, psychiatric nurses, but they also drew in people like peer supporters and GPs into this multidisciplinary group. Which they enabled to work with these 12 individuals that included people who'd been cycling within the mental health system for years, being in and out of crisis, in and out of secondary mental health services. And they created the conditions that that group could also rapidly draw on the wide range of materials and opportunities that were available, including personal budgets. So they set up the conditions so that a personal budget of £500 could be drawn on within 24 hours for anything legal. And through doing this, they could explore the principles that they'd identified and start to generate solutions simply through testing these with real individuals in the real world. And these were people who had enrolled on that process, so they'd given their consent to engage. And it started to generate some really significant evidence around different ways of working that were far more collaborative, far more multidisciplinary, and started to generate evidence around a much more preventative model of mental health. And through that process, and then through refining and using that learning forum that they'd created, they were managed to generate the evidence and make the case for change in order to now be running a similar process, drawing on the learning from that with half of Lambeth Borough. And in the next 3 months or so, they'll be rolling that out across the whole borough. So from that learning process, they've developed a really good sense of knowledge. So if I jump to the next slide, just to cover, so what were the key factors for success? So this idea of principle-led exploration was really significant, defining a set of principles and then using those to explore the problem and then generate solutions within this exploratory testing. To convene those learning forums and consider who it is you need to be convening in order to elicit the best examples and best opportunities. And to do that real-world experimentation, take the brave step of engaging real users in the real world, but in that exploratory frame. So, next slide. So the next mode of testing is to look at this idea of testing what we think we know is right. So this is about having a specific hypothesis, having a specific theory of change, and it's about using testing in order to refine those ideas and generate some evidence about what's working. So if we jump to the next slide, the example we have here is around unemployment. And so this was with an organisation, Participle, that some of you might have heard of, who develop public services. And the challenge we were looking at was to look at how we could develop a model of support for those unemployed based on social networking. So a clear hypothesis that we wanted to test. If we jump to the next slide. Now, clearly, what was really significant around this was to have that clear hypothesis and have it based on evidence, existing evidence, and so that we have a clear understanding of what we want to test. So the idea around people gaining employment through their social network came from a range of different evidence sources, including some quantitative evidence that was generated which suggested that over 80% of people get work through their social networks, but also a set of ethnographic research that we'd done in order to identify this as a potential solution. So through a process we worked with 10 participants, all of whom were long-term unemployed, so between 3 and 12 years unemployed. And if we jump to the next stage, next slide, what we did was we explored the whole service. So we tested our hypothesis at every different stage across a whole journey through the service. So rather than just testing a specific aspect of it, we tested how we would move people from being unaware about a service to being aware about that service, the process of joining and enrolling a new service, right to the process of them helping others to grow their social networks and engage. And so if we jump to the next slide, what was specifically important here was having that theory of change. We knew we wanted to test a range of different aspects. And so gathering the right evidence to ensure that we were testing each specific part of that theory of change was really critical. So looking at that wider set of questions that were associated with getting work through your social network, what we did was we ensured that we were testing some of the crux questions that were identified by the evidence. So for example, how do you convert connections that you might have into actual job opportunities, to how might you kind of be supported to grow your social network. And we then developed evidence based on that in terms of, through the support that we could give people, what the impact would be. And so we developed evidence that was both around charting the theory of change and the different stages of that theory of change, and looking at how each person of the 10 participants that we worked with, how they moved through the different stages and what worked and what didn't, and gathering evidence around that, right to the evidence of the impacts that we created. So with taking this approach from 10 participants, they developed 120 new connections, and significantly 6 of the 10 got permanent or semi-permanent work. And after a year, 2 of them were still in employment from that support. So it was clearly around trying to gather the right evidence to make the case for this hypothesis, but to think about that hypothesis in a number of stages. So if we jump to the next slide, so what was critical here was having that evidence-based hypothesis that we could test. So we needed to know what we were testing and the critical questions we wanted to test within that. The second was around that modelling the whole journey. So not just thinking about some of the core interactions of your service and your ideas and testing those, but modelling the whole process, because that's how you're going to really get to understand whether your theory of change, whether your hypothesis is correct, and what are some of the critical moments in somebody's journey that might impact negatively or positively within that hypothesis. And finally, it's about evidencing your hypothesis, ensuring that you're gathering the right evidence to make the case for that hypothesis. And again, that's looking at those crux questions that you need to answer, as well as some of the wider outcomes that you want to achieve. And if we jump further on, so the last mode of exploration I want to talk about is this idea of refining your ideas. And this is, I suppose, what we more traditionally use some of this prototyping and testing to do. So this is when we have an explicit activity or solution. It might be an explicit or activity or solution that we found from elsewhere, from an organisation doing similar work to ourselves, from another country, from another practice even. And we want to refine those ideas and generate evidence of impact, but also understand what some of the kind of challenges and conditions for scaling that support might be. So the example, if we jump to the next slide and quickly tell you about, is around COPD. So we did some work with North East London Innovation Cluster, which was a kind of NHS initiative, to look at the challenge around empowering patients suffering with COPD with data on the quality of their care in order to improve outcomes. So this was something that was an idea that was generated from other sectors, using some of this information to change the behaviours of patients, but also to change the behaviours of GPs. And so if we jump to the next slide, what we did to explore that was very significantly, although we had an understanding of what that solution was, we worked with just 5 participants and went and explored the context of use of the innovation that we were doing. So the innovation was, very briefly, it was a checklist, a printed checklist that described a patient's support based on the 5 NICE requirements that were identified and what they were receiving in terms of the support they were getting, and some wider information about the quality of care that they were getting. And we looked at exploring what some of the barriers and enablers might be, but in people's homes around using this product. And this was really significant because the client wanted to jump into testing this with 5,000 people, but very quickly we saw that there were some very specific challenges around the use in an individual's context, which specifically, the picture you can see is a guy, Bob. Bob couldn't read very well, struggled to read. He also, in front of him, there was sitting a pile of about 40 unopened envelopes, and when talking about getting the checklist through the post, he said, well, to be honest, it would just go there on the pile along with everything else, so he would never engage with it. So just through testing this in situ, we could look at, if we wanted to scale this, we needed to think about how we would ensure that people were engaging with it and picking it up. So it moved quite quickly to GPs giving it to patients, and patients being able to take it home and be told about the context of its use. If we jump to the next slide, what was really significant in testing to do this refining process was to test at high resolution. So the artifacts that we were creating were as close as we could possibly get to the artifacts that would be going out at scale, the final artifacts. And this is really significant because often it's in the detail that some of these ideas fail. So if you can, through that refining process, test the artifacts, the environments, the information, the relationships, all as in high resolution, as close to what the reality of the service might be, the better, because you'll learn so much more significantly from it. And if we jump to the next slide, what was very important with them, and as I described before, there was a drive to quickly test this, to move to piloting this with about 5,000 patients across northeast London. And just holding them back to do some work to explore this with 5 patients was incredibly useful. It gave us incredible amounts of insight around what some of those conditions might be in order to get that scale. But then testing it with a large number enabled us to generate some of the evidence that we needed to show that this idea was worth pursuing, was worth growing beyond that. Because obviously testing with a small amount of individuals is not going to generate the type of evidence that we want to see. So within the COPD, for example, there was a 6% reduction in emergency hospital admissions within the first 3 months, and 6% wouldn't be massively exciting if it was only with 5 patients, but if it's with 5,000 patients, obviously that's a much better evidence base for us to work from. So if we jump to the next slide, and actually if we skip slide 22, because I think that's a duplication. So the key factors for success on slide 23. So again, this thing of examining solutions in situ, I can't stress how significant that is, how much learning we generate from doing that. Testing at high resolution, again, the amount of ideas that fail because of small details that are often overlooked in an exploratory and testing process, and being able to look at the complete artifacts as much as possible really generates really good learning. And finally, that idea of stepped scale in any testing process is incredibly significant. So quickly, if we jump to the next slide, just talking about what this might describe as a kind of model process, a model approach. And we can examine this in what we might describe as a prototyping-led model approach to testing. So if we jump to the next slide, some of you might have heard this before, but it's quite a useful mantra in this idea of testing, which is this idea of failing earlier and often in order to succeed sooner. And this is a key thing when we're thinking about testing. If we create the opportunities through engaging with users, through engaging with practitioners and professionals, with our ideas, we can fail earlier and often, and that will enable us to understand what we need to do differently in a range of different ways in order to succeed sooner. And if we jump to the last slide here, in my presentation, what this describes is this model, and I've kind of moved through this in these different phases. We have a phase around explore, which is that exploratory model I described. We have a phase around the modeling of ideas, which is often around that hypothesis, and then we have a phase which is about refining those ideas. And what the graph tries to describe, the grey line, is around the number of ideas that we're going to generate. So in that explore phase, we can test in order to generate ideas. The model phase, we might have a lot of ideas that will be at that point perhaps at lower resolution, like with the unemployment, and through modelling that process we can develop those ideas, and the final, when we're working at high resolution, we can refine those ideas right down. And so that might be a useful frame to think about testing your ideas from, to move through those different phases, to think about using prototyping and testing as an exploratory and developmental process as well as a refining process, and to use that idea of working from very low resolution, like the simulation in Lambeth, with people just play acting different roles, right to the higher resolution of specific products and specific relationships that you might have. Okay, so that's me done. I suppose we can move on to any questions.